Welcome back to Transformative Pedagogy, the podcast where we're cultivating equity in education. I'm your host, Laura Paz Huerta, and in today's episode, we're tackling a topic that is near and dear to my heart and not only crucial for academic success, but it's deeply rooted in the ongoing struggle for social justice in education, and that's inclusive education for English learners here in California. As many of you know, California is home to one of the largest population of English learners in the U.S., with over 1.5 million students. These are all students that are coming from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And they're also facing significant challenges in schools that are often ill-equipped to support them. Today, we're going to be discussing the best practices for inclusive education in the context of social justice. So buckle up or take a sip of your coffee. We're going to be going over how to ensure that these EL students not only thrive, but also have equal access to the full range of educational and equitable opportunities available to all. At the heart of this conversation is the belief that all students, regardless of their language background, deserve a fair and equitable education. So let's dive in, educators, and follow me on this amazing podcast journey. All right, everyone. So before we dive into the best practices and strategies, we really need to understand the state of English learners, or ELs, as to how they're sometimes referred to here in California. Now, as we're processing all this information and getting to know these type of learners, it's especially important to look at them through the lens of social justice, or I would say a social justice and education lens. Now, according to the California Department of Education, approximately 22% of all K through 12 students in California are classified as ELs, or English learners. This amounts to over 1.5 million students. Now, these students represent a very diverse range of linguistic and cultural backgrounds, speaking more than 100 different languages. And not surprisingly, the most common languages spoken by EL students is Spanish, followed by Mandarin, Punjabi, and Tagalog. Now, despite this linguistic and cultural diversity, EL students still face significant systemic barriers that hinder their academic success. Now, these barriers are deeply rooted in language, race, and socioeconomic status. According to a 2020 report by the California Legislative Analyst's Office, EL students in California tend to have lower graduation rates and academic achievement levels compared to their English-speaking peers. This is a critical point, simply because EL students represent some of the most marginalized communities in our state here in California. Now, a good example of this is graduation rates. And graduation rates for EL students are consistently lower than other students. Once more, the California Legislative Analyst's Office reports that only 68% of EL students graduate high school within 4 years. And that's being compared to their 87% of native English-speaking students. Now, I don't know about you, but this disparity is really troubling, given that our EL students often come from low-income backgrounds as well, which ultimately compounds the barriers that they face. As a result, these students, these English learning students, are more likely to be tracked into lower academic pathways, further perpetuating inequities in education. Now, this is where the social justice or social justice in education part comes in. These disparities are not indicative of a lack of potential in our EL students, but rather the result of structural inequalities. And these structural inequalities ultimately limit their access to quality resources, experienced educators, and inclusive learning environments. Now, there's research that shows that these systemic barriers, whether in underfunding, limited access to bilingual resources, or insufficient teacher training, all of these create an environment where EL students cannot fully thrive. Then we have the Public Policy Institute of California, which found that schools with large EL populations receive on average 13% less funding than schools with predominantly native English speakers, which impacts the resources available to support these EL learners. Additionally, standardized testing exacerbates these inequities. Many EL students are assessed using the same test as native English speakers, often without adequate accommodations to account for language barriers. According to a 2019 study by the American Educational Research Association, EL students score on average 30 to 40% lower on standardized assessments, such as the SATs, compared to their English-speaking peers. Obviously, this creates an inaccurate portrayal of academic abilities, and ultimately it impacts their opportunities for advanced coursework or college admissions. So what can be done? Well, addressing these disparities is an urgent issue of equity. If we want to make sure, and we want to ensure that all students, regardless of language or background or culture, have the opportunity to succeed, we must address the systemic obstacles that hinder their progress. Social justice in education calls on us to dismantle these barriers and create these spaces where EL students can not only participate, but also excel academically. So how do we achieve this? Well, I think it's safe to say that it's crucial to advocate for more inclusive practices such as differentiated instruction, scaffolding strategies, and culturally responsive teaching. And by addressing these issues and leveling the playfield, we can work towards an education system that truly supports the academic potential of every student, including our EL learners. All right, listeners, something that we truly need to comprehend is that inclusive education for EL students is not just a pedagogical choice. It's a matter of social justice in education. Social justice in education means more than fighting for equitable outcomes for all students. It means addressing the unique needs of our EL learners as well. And at its core, inclusive education is about ensuring that all students have this access to high quality learning opportunities, regardless of their linguistic or cultural or economic or religious background. Now, this goes beyond language acquisition. It's about ensuring that our EL students are included in every aspect of the educational experience, whether that's academic content, extracurricular activities, even social engagement. California has made strides in moving away from practices like the ones introduced by Prop 227 in 1998, which limited bilingual education and forced many EL students into English-only instruction. Now, this was a significant setback in the fight for educational equity. Thankfully, there was a shift toward more inclusive practices, such as sheltered instruction and dual language immersion programs that not only prioritize academic success, but it prioritizes language development as well. And inclusive education as a social justice and education issue is really about breaking down the barriers that prevent EL students from accessing the full benefits of education. It's also about recognizing that their cultural and linguistic diversity is an asset, not a deficit, and that their identities should always be valued and integrated into the learning process within your classroom. So, what does inclusive education for EL students look like in practice? And another question you might have is, how does it relate to the broader goals of social justice and education? Well, let's break down some key strategies. The first one is differentiated instruction. And this is a critical strategy for ensuring that English learners receive the tailored support they need to succeed in a classroom. It involves adapting teaching methods to meet the diverse needs of learners, such as through visual aids, simplified language, and even providing extra time for assignments when needed. The importance of this approach cannot be overstated, especially when we consider the achievement gaps that often exist between our EL students and their native English-speaking peers. It's important to note that research from the National Center for Education Statistics shows that EL students are significantly less likely to meet academic standards compared to their peers. In fact, only 27% of EL students scored at or above the proficient level in reading on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And this study was done back in 2019, compared to 42% of non-EL students. So, by differentiating instruction, teachers can meet EL students where they are, ensuring they have equal access to rigorous academic content. For example, in a study from the University of Miami, teachers who have incorporated differentiated strategies such as visual aids, peer support, and culturally relevant content saw a 20% increase in reading scores for their EL students over the course of a semester. Now, this is important because it helps to close that achievement gap by making content accessible while maintaining academic rigor. And I can attest to this. There's been numerous times where I've had EL students of mine read an article or a book from their own country, and the amount of interest is just reaches a higher level. They're excited to read now because they're reading there's something they're familiar with. And so there's a great reading program right now called Read Along on Google. It's supplied by Google, and it's kind of a really good, warm up for my EL students, where they're reading different cultural books, and they're practicing their reading skills and their speaking skills, and they're getting excited to learn. And so this increase to reading can attest to that. And that's how I'm differentiating instruction in my classroom to meet these EL students, and make sure that the content they are seeing in my classroom is relevant to them and it's exciting, and they're willing to put the work in, because I'm willing to put the work in as well. Another amazing strategy is scaffolding. And so scaffolding is the practice of providing temporary support to students as they work toward independence. And this is especially important for our EL students. This includes, pre-teaching vocab, using graphic organizers, offering sentence starters, or breaking down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. Scaffolding not only aids language development, but it helps students gain the skills needed for academic success. There was a study conducted by the Center for Research on Education, Diversity, and Excellence that found that EL students who received scaffolding, particularly in the form of visual aids and vocabulary development, improved their comprehension scores by 15% over a school year. Furthermore, there was another study done by the California State University, which highlighted the effectiveness of sentence frames and structured academic discussions in supporting EL students in writing and speaking. So, in classrooms where these scaffolds were used, EL students showed a 30% increase in writing proficiency. Again, putting my 2 cents in, right? I've noticed, where the difference in which I say, hey, here's your assignment, get it done. I give them the instructions and they have no clue what to do. Now, when I scaffold and I break the tasks into smaller, manageable steps, and I say, hey, let's do section 1 together, right? Let's start with our sentences. And now we're going to write a paragraph. Now we're going to type it up. And now we're going to record ourselves reading our sentences. I've seen improvement in the students and in their work as opposed to leaving them to their own devices. And this also works well with vocabulary. Learning the vocabulary by sections, whether it's 5 to 10 words one day and then another 5 to 10 words the next day, and practicing these words, using them in sentences, using them in sentence frames, creating our own sentences and practicing those, reading those sentences out loud truly helps our students understand the concepts of the vocab words and why they're so important for this unit. So again, scaffolding just truly plays a crucial role in helping our EL students and bridging the gap between where they are and where they need to be. And not only is it a tool for language development, but a powerful tool for advancing social justice and education by leveling the academic playing field. Now, another important strategy is culturally responsive teaching. And, some of these strategies may seem a bit redundant, but it doesn't mean they're not as important in this episode as opposed to in a previous episode. So again, going back to culturally responsive teaching, it's culturally responsive teaching, or CRT, which is a very, very important and powerful approach that seeks to recognize and value the cultural backgrounds of all students in the classroom, particularly our EL students, since we're focusing on these kids today, right, in this podcast episode. So by integrating our students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds into the curriculum, we foster not only their academic success, but also the development of their identity. Now, CRT, or culturally responsive teaching, shifts the focus from a one-size-fits-all approach to education to one that celebrates diversity and it views, diversity and these diverse cultures as an asset rather than a challenge. Now, a study from the University of California in Berkeley found that EL students who were taught in culturally responsive classrooms scored 10 to 15% higher on standardized tests compared to those in traditional classrooms. And, this was particularly true in schools that included diverse literature and content that reflected the students' home cultures and languages. And, along with that, this research shows that when the students' cultures and and backgrounds are acknowledged and incorporated into the lessons, they perform better academically and they feel more engaged in their learning, right? They want to come back. They say this is their safe space. This is their safe classroom. They miss you when they don't see you. They say that they like to come to your class, that they're learning more. You know, I had an EL student this morning come in and say, I miss your class. I miss you. Another teacher told me my English is better and it's because of your class. And I just remember her coming in on her first day shy and not knowing, if she was doing okay or not, but just seeing her flourish now and speak a lot more and hold these conversations. And it's because of, CRT, and it's because of scaffolding and all of this, and differentiating instruction, making sure that I see her and I include her in my teachings all the time. And that's what makes a difference. Now, there's a school district in Los Angeles that implemented a culturally responsive curriculum. And they saw EL student engagement increase by 25%. So this corresponded with a 12% improvement in math and reading scores. So again, by incorporating students' lives and incorporating their lived experiences, their backgrounds, their cultures into lessons, we as educators can break down the barriers of disengagement and help EL students feel seen and heard. Which leads me to my next strategy, which is peer support and collaboration. These are key elements in fostering inclusive classrooms. So by pairing EL students with proficient English speakers in group activities, we create natural environments for language development. These peer interactions not only enhance language skills, but it also promotes social integration and help eliminate these stereotypes. There was a study done from the University of Arizona that found that EL students who were involved in peer collaborative learning showed a 20% increase in vocabulary acquisition compared to those who worked independently. Moreover, peer collaboration led to a higher social integration score. And as students worked together and supported each other, you saw these scores rise and you saw them overcome these language barriers. An example of this in action can be seen in bilingual programs, specifically the ones in San Diego Unified School District, where EL students are paired with English-speaking peers for group work. This collaboration led to significant improvements in both language proficiency and social emotional development. This demonstrated, right, how peer support contributes to both academic and personal growth. Not only that, but our next strategy is a really important one, and that's ongoing professional development for teachers, right? We as teachers have to be well equipped to meet the unique needs of our EL students. And by having this ongoing professional development and best practices for our ELs, this ensures us that as educators, we're continuously adapting to newer methods and strategies to support our students' academic and language development needs and their education. It's a commitment, right, as we continue on with professional development for our ELs to help support our ELs. That reflects our broader goals of social justice and education by ensuring that every student, regardless of their language background, receives the support that they need to succeed. A report from the National Education Association indicated that teachers who received ongoing training in language acquisition and cultural competency saw a 25% improvement in EL students' reading and writing skills. Stanford University also found that schools that had invested in continuous professional development for their teachers had a 15% higher graduation rate for EL students over a 5-year period. So what does that tell us? Well, it doesn't tell us, it screams at us that by committing to ongoing professional development, schools not only improve academic outcomes for EL students, but they also promote a culture of inclusivity and equity, ensuring that all teachers are prepared to support their diverse learners. So, despite the implementation of best practices for supporting English learners, these students continue to face significant challenges, many of which are rooted in systemic inequalities. These barriers disproportionately affect marginalized communities. These disparities in educational outcomes are exacerbating, and they're hindering the academic success of our EL students. One of the most pressing challenges is underfunding. Schools with large EL populations often lack the necessary resources to effectively support these students, including access to bilingual teachers, language support materials, and smaller class sizes. A report from the Public Policy Institute of California revealed that schools in California with high percentages of EL students are 1.5 times more likely to be underfunded compared to schools with lower EL populations. This underfunding directly impacts the quality of education EL students receive, including their access to specialized instruction, which is essential for their academic growth. According to a study conducted by the National Council of Teachers of English, approximately 60% of EL students in low-income areas do not have access to specialized language support, such as ESL teachers or bilingual resources. And this lack of investment in EL education not only undermines the educational opportunities available to these students, but also constitutes an issue of racial and economic justice. As the Public Policy Institute of California emphasizes, this funding disparity, it's a key driver of the achievement gap. And us as educators or advocates of students, whoever we may be, addressing it is essential to advancing social equity in our education system. Standardized testing continues to be a significant challenge for EL students. These students are often assessed using the same criteria as native English speakers, without considering the language barriers that may hinder their performance. There was a study done in 2019 from the American Educational Research Association that found that EL students score on average 30 to 40% lower than their peers on these standardized tests. And so I've mentioned this before, right? Like the SAT and state-mandated assessments. And it's that disparity that exists because these students fail on account of language proficiency. And it's an unfair assessment of their academic abilities. I've seen some of the smartest students come into my classroom, but it's because of a lack of their language proficiency, that they're not yet they're able to communicate, in English that, it our system fails them. They're given an unfair assessment of their abilities because of this language barrier. Now, the California Department of Education reported that EL students who are still in the early stages of language acquisition perform significantly lower on the state's academic assessments. And these are not designed to measure language development. So this issue of testing bias is an example of how structural inequalities in the educational system can further marginalize our English learner students. And it reinforces cycles of inequity, and it makes it harder for them to demonstrate their true academic potential. So what can we do? What can be done? Well, by advocating for more equitable forms of assessments, such as assessments that accommodate language barriers or assess content knowledge independently of language proficiency, we can work towards a more just education system for all of our students. Research from the Education Trust advocates for the use of language inclusive assessments that evaluate EL students' content knowledge without penalizing them from limited English proficiency. These types of assessments have shown promise in improving the academic outcomes for EL learners by providing a more accurate picture of their academic abilities. So if they can do it, why can't we? So as we look toward the future, it's clear that creating a more inclusive and equitable education system for our English learners is essential for advancing social justice in education. The educational disparities faced by our EL students are significant and require systemic change in both policy and practice. The goal here is not just to ensure EL students meet academic standards, but also to empower them academically by valuing their cultural and linguistic diversity. One exciting development I came across in this movement is the expansion of dual language immersion programs, especially here in California. And these programs, in which students are taught in both their native language and English, um, have been shown to promote academic success while also preserving students' linguistic and cultural identities. I've seen dual language immersion programs such as Spanish and English and Mandarin in English, Japanese in English. And so it's really, really interesting to see their development of these students' language and cultural identities. So research demonstrates that dual language immersion programs can be highly beneficial for our EL students. For example, a study from the Center for Applied Linguistics found that EL students in dual language programs scored significantly higher on reading and math tests, up to 20% higher in some cases, compared to their peers in English-only programs. In addition, these dual language programs foster greater cultural understanding. And this study done by Stanford University, it was a longitudinal study, by the way, found that students in dual language programs exhibited more positive attitudes towards cultural diversity, reporting a 30% increase in cross-cultural empathy and understanding over time. And to be honest with you, this aligns with the core principles of social justice and education. By ensuring that EL students not only succeed academically, but also develop strong cultural identities. And these dual language programs help level the playing field and combat the marginalization of minority languages. Now, the rise of technology in education also presents new opportunities for our EL learners. With the availability of language learning apps, there's also online resources and digital platforms that EL students can now access language development tools at their own pace. And this makes learning more personalized and flexible. A report by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2020 revealed that EL students using technology-assisted language programs demonstrated a 15% increase in vocab retention and a 10% improvement in reading comprehension as well. I like to do a little fun Duolingo challenge with my students. They use Duolingo at home, right? And whoever gets the top 3 at the end of each quarter, gets a little prize in class. And so you see them actually coming to you and saying, "Hey, I learned this word today," or "I used this word that I learned in Duolingo." And it's surprising to see how much fun they're having because you're giving them that opportunity to learn and be flexible with their learning at home as well. It's not so much forced upon them. And I mean, technology is everywhere. They utilize it at home as well. So this is also a great opportunity. Now, the progress can only be sustained if we ensure that all students, particularly those from low-income families, have equal access to these technological resources. Research from the Pew Research Centers shows that there is a significant digital divide, with 35% of families in low-income communities lacking reliable internet access at home. Now, it's important to understand that this gap could further exacerbate educational inequities if not addressed. And a lot of districts here in California have learned to bridge that gap, providing internet for free at home for students to utilize, and Chromebooks being sent home, but that's not the case for everybody, right? And so making sure that we're providing equitable access to technology is a crucial component for ensuring that our EL students from all backgrounds have the tools they need to succeed, especially in this modern educational landscape that we currently live in. Finally, family and community engagement is crucial for the success of our EL students. And there's studies consistently showing that when schools partner with families and communities, students are more likely to thrive academically and socially. There was a study done by the American Educational Research Association that found that EL students with engaged parents are 20% more likely to graduate high school compared to those whose parents are less involved in their education. So what can be done about that, right? What can be done about bridging the gap between yourself, the educator, your students, and their parents? Well, the first step towards that is creating a welcoming environment for parents and providing resources in their native language. That's essential to fostering this partnership. There was a case study done by the Los Angeles Unified School District that demonstrated that schools with excellent parent outreach programs included translation services and family workshops. And because of these resources and this outreach program, there was a 15% increase in parental involvement and a 10% increase in student achievement. So this community-centered approach aligns with the values of social justice and education. By recognizing that every student's success is deeply linked to the support and involvement of, that's right, you, their educator, of their families and their communities. We have to show up for our students, right? And we have to show that we care, and we have to figure out a way to bridge that gap for them. So before we wrap up today's episode, I want to take a moment to thank the organizations and research that make conversations like this possible. So this podcast was brought to you by the incredible work of those who are advancing equity in education, including resources and research from the California Department of Education, the Public Policy Institute of California, and the University of California in Berkeley, whose studies on culturally responsive teaching and differentiated instruction have shaped our understanding of how to support English learners. We've also drawn on insights from the American Educational Research Association and their research on the impact of standardized testing, which highlights the need for fair assessment practices for EL students. These organizations, along with the reports and frameworks from the California Legislative Analyst's Office and the International Journal of Inclusive Education, all truly contribute to the broader movement for social justice in education. Their work helps us reimagine a more inclusive and equitable learning environment for all students. Finally, as I come to conclude today's episode, it's important to see that inclusive education for English language learners is not just about teaching English to students of a different country, right? Different cultural background. It's about challenging systemic inequities and creating an educational system that is truly just for all students. So by implementing best practices like differentiated instruction, scaffolding, and culturally responsive teaching, we're making strides towards a more equitable and inclusive education system that truly serves everyone. So once again, thank you for listening to the Transformative Pedagogy, Cultivating Equity in Education podcast. Remember, social justice in education requires us to constantly reflect, adapt, and act in ways that center the needs of all of our students, particularly those from marginalized communities. So if you believe in a fair, more just educational system, then this conversation has to continue. And it continues with you sharing what you've learned, right? From these podcasts, not just from today, but from all the previous ones as well. So please subscribe and share this podcast with others who are committed to advancing equity in education. I'm Laura Paz Huerta, and I'll see you in the next episode. But until then, stay informed and stay engaged. Have a good one, educators.